Okay, in week 3, we want to build on our learning from the first 2 weeks. So far, I've had you think about the stubborn fact that there was no one culture, which means there's no one story in the history of the United States. Um, I'm hoping that you'll start to link that to your own cultural story and to maybe think about it with your family and your friends about how different perspectives of your own culture tell a different American story, right? So we want to start collecting as many ideas of what people think the United States is, or even what New York City is, in order to better understand politics. Because in week 2, what Director Nasser and I were really trying to get you to understand is that politics is social, right? So when people say they don't like politics, that's fine to have that attitude, right? But it's like saying, I don't like eating food. You need to do it whether you like it or not. And politics in the United States is because it's a power relation struggle. So you're either going to be, powerless, or you're going to be in some resistance, or you're going to be in a powerful role, right? And we just want you to understand that politics is kind of everywhere and is everything. And you'll start to unpack that. But Director Nasser's kind of quote she uses is that democracy is not a spectator sport, meaning that if you think you're in the audience, what's really happening to you is just not clear to you, obviously. But one day you'll kind of wake up and realize that you've been sitting out of a game that's been playing you. So going into week 3, what I really want you to start understanding is that language and structures influence your mind and how you see the world. So we want to kind of start with one myth that most of you probably learned in high school. Hopefully not in another class at Kingsborough, but it's possible. Or, it's a popular myth that kind of just permeates throughout TED Talks. Very intelligent people who have just not taken the time to really look into the stubborn facts of the science. And this is idea that we kind of live in a dystopia, right? That we live in a war against all, or some people use, incorrectly, they use Darwin's concept that applied to organisms socially. So they say social Darwinism. And again, these phrases might be helpful to certain people in understanding real basics of like the structure of life, but they're not accurate. And so what we want to do is try to get to a more accurate representation of social reality. And so one of the big kind of things that maybe professors should explain when they're talking about this big, huge concept of the Enlightenment, especially as it relates to kind of that period between the 1400s and the 1800s, is that suddenly there's this power in complaining. And that's my phrase, right? But I'm just trying to bring it to this kind of like real simple way of thinking about it, that for, over 1,000 years, if you complained, you better be in the middle of the desert, with a small group of people. Because if you try to complain to anyone who holds a powerful position in government or in religion, there's a very good chance that you're going to end up dead. So for a period of time, really going into the 1100s up to like the 1400s, people were mostly just kind of going with the flow and really believing a lot of things that were harming their self-interest. So much to the point where they kind of stopped thinking about that concept of self-interest, right? So from generation to generation, you're told that, basically you're born into slavery, you should stay a slave. If your dad was a knight and fought for the king, then that's what you're going to do. If your mom was a farmer, then that's what you're going to do, right? So much so that people started believing that like these skills and these trades were passed down through the genes, right? And people really had these kind of wild notions that had no scientific basis. But if no one's allowed to complain, then you see the problem here, I hope. So suddenly people started complaining a lot, and they started criticizing power structures. They started criticizing, how food is produced. They started criticizing whether they should have freedom. And this led to this kind of myth today that this is what we're all supposed to be doing all the time. But in the reading that you got, you should understand, right? Your brain is not for that kind of thinking. Your brain is a processor of resource allocation. It's all about surviving and reproducing. And what it does is it sets a budget, right? So did you get enough inputs for the outputs that you're trying to do? And I know many of you understand that really well. Like you, when I was in community college, I had to work. So there were some days where I would go to school and my budget was really low, right? Um, you know, I had worked late. I had maybe not eaten the food that I was hoping that I would have eaten. And then I had to wake up. I woke up late, right? So I have to rush to class, or now you rush to the Zoom, and you don't get the breakfast, right, that maybe you had hoped to get. So your inputs are really low, and then you're expected to, take a quiz or understand this really complicated thing. And so, your brain tries, right? You try to get through that, but that's not what it's made to do. All it can think about is, please give me more food. I need more sleep. And, ultimately, I need to reproduce my genes. And so, this has really big implications or consequences for thinking about social theory, right? This is about life and death then. So what we want to think about is, under what conditions would stability and predictability be conducive to this kind of brain, right? To reproducing, to getting enough food, and to kind of, doing the things that we take for granted so often. Now, having explained that you and I have already had to kind of, bust our brain budget, this society is obviously not very good for our real brains. So it's, constructed on this myth of the brain, right? That we're in this power struggle against each other, and that if we don't participate in this accumulation, then we're going to die. But this is obviously like the opposite of reality. And so these two assignments that I give you is to explore, right? Explore the stubborn fact of migration, that humans have been migrating for thousands of years, if not hundreds of thousands of years. And really like see who loses in this grand migration, and then probably more importantly think about who wins in this grand migration. The second thing that you want to think about is basically how this relates to the slave trade, right? And I am making the comparison that the current migration, and so is the United Nations and other groups, that we're still in this slave trade mentality as far as our economy goes. And so you want to go back to that like first slide or that first week and think about, this kind of struggle of culture. And remember, in the South, the slave trade is getting really steaming up. And again, if you see the map here, look where the slaves are going, right? And so you want to think about, this is a basic, I grew up, in and around boats and on the water. But you can see there's trade winds. That's, think about that phrase, trade, right? Economic trade winds that carry ships from West Africa over to the southeast coast. And so that's a bit of that unlucky, right? There's some unluck going on there, as to where you end up, as to where you're born, and as to what social system that you're kind of falling into. And so when we think about objects of reproduction, one of the objects of reproduction here, the thing that's being reproduced, right? So if you think about your cell phone or your computer, it has pieces that came from parts of Africa, or pieces that then went to a lab in, say, Mexico or China, and then those were assembled and put into your cell phone, right? So those objects are reproduced into the final product of your cell phone. Then you throw your cell phone away, and then it becomes reproduced into some other object. But there's also human objects of reproduction here, right? You have people, oftentimes children, who are stolen today and in the Atlantic slave trade, who are then expected to reproduce future slaves. And so, we've got this mentality that this is the system that we need in order to protect us and have us, continue to work on, because we're in this social struggle against ourselves. But this is wrong, right? And so this power of complaining, needs to be used to turn it back against the system itself, right? And this is where we start thinking about technology of change, right? Whether it's social media, or these technological maps that are being produced, there's all this kind of evidence now that we're using technology to really reconsider our social relations. And so I don't want to go too far into that. I just want you to think about it, right? In what ways do those technologies, and I want to be a little critical here, right? Or complaining. If you look at certain social media, there are a fair amount of young folks who are using social media to reproduce this objectification, right? And whether they realize it or not, they're objectifying themselves, right? But on the other hand, I could say I'm guilty, right? I objectify my dog, right? So I treat my dog as an object, and then I share that object on social media. So we still kind of participate in this, and this is why I say language and structures affect our minds, right? But on the other hand, right, my friends are at the same time posting pictures, objects of animals that are being mistreated in the world, and then raising money to try to, free and save those animals. So there's this kind of double thing going on here. So then we have to ask, where do humans come in? Well, if on the one hand our brains are not for thinking, right, they're for surviving, for eating, and for reproducing, are we adapting to this system? Are we accepting it? Are we rebelling it? Or are we constructing it, right? Are we making this system? I think, we all have different roles to play, and that's why we want to think about role power as we go forward. But a lot of this has to do with bad luck or good luck, right? Depending on where and how you're born and who you are. And then a lot of this has to do with what language are you using. If you call yourself an asset, that means, you also will have liabilities. And then what does that mean? Who does that affect? If you call yourself an object, or you treat yourself as an object, that means somebody's using you as an object. If you see yourself as free, if you see yourself as unlimited, right? How does that replicate itself or reproduce itself in the real world, right? So these are the questions that you want to think about, so that now we're kind of churning the corner. We've kind of now we have to deal with stubborn facts. We started out with a lot of myths, and now we were trying to break those down. And so as we churn the corner, we're going to start to use this concept of finding utopia, right? Assuming for a second that we can leave this crazy idea of the Enlightenment period. How would we start to construct this kind of more reasonable social space based on this reality, right? The stubborn reality that our brain is a budget allocator, right? And that it's not anything really more complicated than that.